Joe, we just heard Another Day. What inspired you to write that song?
Well, that song, I was inspired by my brother George. My brother George suffered from manic depression and also alcoholism, and he had drug problems at times, did some drugs. And, for quite many years, he was unmedicated and, he dealt with his demons. That song was inspired because my brother faced up to what was going on with him. And
How did he do that? How did he face up to his demons? What do you
well,
mean?
he got help. He got, therapeutical help, and he went and he took his medications. Back in those days, there were not too many medications to help people that had what they called at that time manic depression.
Mm-hmm.
And he did. He stuck to it, and he also stopped drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like I got my little brother back because there was many years that he had these real difficult times, outbursts, and he had some tough times. He was in some mental institutions, and and
How did your family and you, how did you handle him being in a mental institution sometimes, or dealing with his medication issues? Because I know from personal experience that it's difficult if you have a family member who's taking medication for a mental illness, or if they have a mental illness. It can be difficult for the family as well as the person. So how did you deal with that?
well, me
deal-
personally,
Mhm.
oh boy, when he first had his first breakdown, which was he was a student up at Syracuse University, and he was found walking the streets of Harlem in the snowstorm, and and we got a call from the police station. My dad and I drove up 4 o'clock in the morning, and
Oh my goodness.
how I dealt with it was I didn't know what was going on, frankly.
Mm-hmm.
And my brother shared the room with me, the basement room,
Mm-hmm.
and I really didn't know what to do. It was very confusing to me.
Did your parents, did you know that he had a mental illness, or is that when it first appeared?
That's when it first appeared. He was about
Mhm.
18 years old, and the, we knew that he was smoking a lot of pot and doing other things, and so we thought he freaked out. Like that's what was going on back then. That was 1970, and so we just kept thinking it was a drug overdose or something, acid or something.
Mm-hmm.
But over the course of the years, he went to different outpatient things, and a 2-week thing at Downstate Medical Center in Brooklyn, and he would always have these reoccurring manic episodes, where he wouldn't sleep and he'd just really get pretty crazy, pretty off the wall. And I was scared of my brother quite a bit at times. So when he finally got medicated properly and then got sober, that was a big deal too. Him and I started talking. So for the last 2 years of his life, we used to talk every Sunday night. And, those were really precious times for me. And then,
What did the two of you talk about?
well, unfortunately at the time we were both going through separation and divorce. So we used to talk about that, talk about our kids, talk about that kind of stuff. And, he would tell me about how things were much better for him. He started writing poetry again. He was doing painting again. He was running. He used to run. He ran a lot of marathons. He used to, be into running as exercise, and I was doing the same. And we talk about music too, because he was a great bass player. He learned on an upright bass.
Really?
In elementary school, he was this little tiny guy, and he would just. And then he eventually, got an electric bass. And almost every band I played in the 60s, George was the bass player. He was also the bass player in our jazz band in high school.
Did you ever think of, did you ever consider making any of his poems into songs?
I'd have to take a look, because he wrote quite a few. And that's not a bad idea. That's not a bad idea.
Whenever I can help, I try.
Well, that's pretty helpful.
So Once your brother died, how did you get your spirit back, do you think?
Oh boy, that was well when he died, my whole life, it transformed my life right then. I just recognized how fragile life was.
Mm-hmm.
And he was 39 years old.
Wow.
And he had a massive heart attack. And you know, when we buried him, he's buried in Houston, Texas. As a matter of fact, and I'll talk about my other brother in a bit, but the two of them are buried just about from here to the doorway, away from each other in Houston. But after we buried George, we came home, and I just kept hearing all these positive things that he talked to me about, you know.
When you say you heard that, what do you mean?
I heard his voice in my head, you know, saying, you know, to take care of myself and, you know, really get myself straightened out, you know, because life was really worth living, you know. So I did, you know, a number of different things, and I went to my own therapy and, you know, spiritual work. I also played a lot of music, and I was a sax player for most of my life.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't see that anywhere in any of your bio.
No, yeah. Well, I played sax since I was like 13 years old, and I always played in rock and roll bands. I either played rhythm guitar, sang background vocals, and then whenever there was a sax solo, that's what I would do. And I played in a lot of R&B bands in the city. I used to play with these wonderfully Nigerian reggae artists would come to New York, and they would call up one of my buddies, Jimmy Calaruso, a trumpet player, and the two of us used to be picked up by a lot of different artists that came into the city.
Oh, that must have been exciting.
Oh, it was great.
Who else did you play with?
Oh, I played with a lot of the guys who played with James Brown.
Ah.
There was a couple of guys. There was a bass player, I think Fred Thomas is his name. Then Holly Ferris was the trumpet player. He was the guy that took over the horn section after Maceo Parker left James Brown.
Maceo.
Yeah, and then I played with, there was a couple other guys that played with James Brown, and I played in this R&B band. It was out of Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn, and it was a guy named Bentley he did this kind of like James Brown-like band, you know, and it was great. It was good quality music, and we used to gig around. And then I used to play in wedding bands, and I used to play the Westchester County Fair with, there was an Elvis imitator. He's a famous doctor. He's on the New York Hospital. He's a cardiologist, and his hobby is to be Elvis.
Oh my goodness.
But he's good. And he'd hire the band, and we'd play the Westchester County Fair over at the racetrack.
Well, Andy, let's hear another song from you that you wrote about your brother that time of year again.